Unless you've been living under a rock, you know that in 2024 we are no strangers to war, especially during these last few years. Now, as these wars keep on going, it is hard to see when the end will finally arrive. But have you ever wondered what the shortest war in history was? Well, if you didn't know already, it was the Anglo-Zanzibar War, which, as you might imagine, was a war fought between the United Kingdom and Zanzibar on the 27th of August 1896. Yes, that's right. I didn't say that it started on the 27th of August 1896. No, the whole war happened during that day. So, the reason that this conflict was over within a day was because it only lasted somewhere between 38 and 45 minutes. This war pitted the mightiest and largest empire in history against a tiny island in East Africa. But you might be wondering what brought them to this state in the first place. Alright, so in order to understand the story, we have to go back to 1856 and meet this guy, Sultan Majid bin Said, the son of Said bin Sultan, who was the Sultan of Muscat and Oman. Back then, Oman extended across large parts of the East African coast, but in that year, Majid bin Said declared independence from his father and became the first Sultan of Zanzibar. His independence was recognized by the most powerful country on earth at the time, an empire on which the sun never set. He was later succeeded by Bargash bin Said, but he was unfortunately forced by those pesky British to stop selling humans as property in June 1873. Shocking, I know. We can now skip forward to 1896 and explore Zanzibar town, the capital of Zanzibar, where we can see a palace complex that was built on the seafront. Now, while this was impressive already, what perhaps makes this place more interesting is the existence of the Beit al-Ajaib, or the House of Wonders, a ceremonial palace said to be the first building in East Africa to be provided with this weird new thing called electricity. But I don't think that will be very useful in the future. Now, other than acting like a Karen and making Zanzibar actually pay its workers, and not allowing slavery, the United Kingdom tended to get along fairly well with Zanzibar. However, soon a new kid arrived in town, this being Prussia, which had recently formed the German Empire and wanted a slice of that sweet African pie. Sultan Khalifa had granted rights to his land in Kenya to the imperialist of the United Kingdom, and that of Tanganyika to the imperialist of Prussia, who began imposing horrible conditions such as abolishing slavery. Wow, man, that's crazy. Now, this got the Arab ruling classes pretty upset, since they would now have to actually treat people like people, and so this led to them rebelling in 1888. Now, Sultan Khalifa sent Zanzibari troops led by Brigadier General Lloyd Matthews, a former lieutenant of the Royal Navy, to restore order in Tanganyika. The operation was largely successful, but anti-Prussian feeling among the Zanzibari people remained strong. Further conflicts erupted at Bagamoyo, where 150 natives were killed by Prussian military forces, and at Ketwa, where Prussian officials and their servants were murdered. Khalifa then granted extensive trade rights to the Imperial British East African Company, who, with Prussian assistance, established a naval blockade to halt the continuing domestic slave trade. Now, Khalifa went to heaven, or hell, depending on who you ask, in 1890, and was succeeded by Ali ibn Said. Sultan Ali started off his reign well, banning the domestic slave trade but still allowing slave ownership. So, I guess some progress was made. Ali also declared Zanzibar a British protectorate and appointed Lloyd Matthews as first minister to lead his cabinet. The British were also guaranteed a veto over the future appointment of sultans. That year, the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty was signed between the United Kingdom and Prussia, which officially demarcated the spheres of interest in East Africa and ceded Germany's rights in Zanzibar to the United Kingdom. The British government now had more influence in Zanzibar, and in a continued act of colonial aggression, were still trying to eradicate slavery there. Like, what's these guys' obsession with slavery? Why can't they just let, the slave traders do their things? Anyways, our boy Sultan Ali died in 1893 and was succeeded by this dude, Hamad bin Thuwaini, who became Sultan in 1893. Hamad was still homies with the British, but many of his subjects were mad that they kept trying to actually let slaves be treated like humans. The British started getting sussed out and authorized the Sultan to raise a Zanzibari palace bodyguard of 1,000 men, but these troops were soon fighting the British instead, which was kind of not the point of raising all them in the first place. Now, August 25th, 1896 was definitely a bad day for someone out there, but for sure it was really bad for Sultan Hamad, since he never woke up again. Now, his 29-year-old nephew Khalid bin Bargash seized the opportunity and moved into the palace without the British approving it first. This didn't make him look any less suspicious when rumors were already going around that he may have had something to do with his uncle's death. The British, meanwhile, preferred someone like Hamoud bin Mohammed, who was, just a little bit more obedient and favorably disposed towards them. Khalid was warned by the consul and diplomatic agent to Zanzibar, Basil Cave, and General Matthews to think carefully about his actions. Now, apparently, this wasn't even Khalid's first time trying to sit on the fancy chair, since he had also tried becoming Sultan 3 years earlier, but he had been persuaded not to do so by the British Consul General, Rennell Rodd. This time, though, Khalid ignored the British and their threats, and he gathered his men in the palace square under the command of Captain Saleh of the palace bodyguard. After all, one island was totally going to beat the largest empire the world had ever known, and he would do it with just 2,800 men, most of whom were civilians. Yeah. Not to fear, though, he had several Maxim machine guns, a Gatling gun, two 12-pounder field guns aimed at the British ships in the harbor, and to add on top of that massive armada, he even had a bronze cannon that was just 200 years old. But, it probably still worked, I think. Maybe. In addition, the mighty Royal Navy would be destroyed by the powerful Zanzibari Navy, which consisted of one wooden sloop, the HHS Glasgow, which was just built as a royal yacht for the Sultan back in 1878. Now, obviously, the British were not intimidated, and Matthews and Cave began mustering their forces, already commanding 900 Zanzibari askaris under Lieutenant Arthur Edward Harrington Rakes. 150 sailors and marines were landed from the Pearl-class protected cruiser Philomel and the gunboat Thrush, which were anchored in the harbor. The naval contingent under the command of Captain O'Callaghan came ashore within 15 minutes of being requested to deal with any rioting caused by the general population. A smaller contingent of sailors under Lieutenant Watson of Thrush were put ashore to guard the British consulate, where British citizens were requested to gather for protection. HMS Sparrow, another gunboat, entered the harbor and was anchored opposite the palace next to Thrush. Some concerns were raised among the British diplomats as to the reliability of Rakes' askaris, but they proved to be steady and professional troops hardened by military drill and several expeditions to East Africa. Rakes' troops were armed with 2 Maxim guns and a 9-pounder cannon, and were stationed at the nearby customs house. Cave told Khalid to give up and go home, but Khalid told him that he would proclaim himself Sultan at 15 o'clock, which would basically be a declaration of war. However, there was one problem. Cave could not declare war without the government's approval, so he had to DM the government and say, "Yo, can I shoot this guy already?" Actually, he would have said that if he was American, but he was British, so he said it in a much more posh way, saying, "All we authorized in the event of all attempts at a peaceful solution proving useless to fire on the palace from the men of war." I guess the Wi-Fi was a bit slow, so at 10 o'clock on the 26th of August, the Archer-class protected cruiser Raccoon arrived at Zanzibar town and was anchored in line with Thrush and Sparrow. At 14 o'clock, the Edgar-class protected cruiser St. George steamed into the harbor. On board were Rear Admiral Harry Rawson, the son of Raw, and also the commander-in-chief, and further British Marines and sailors. At around the same time, Cave finally got a reply and was given the green light to attack. The telegraph, because this was pre-WhatsApp days apparently, read, "You are authorized to adopt whatever measures you may consider necessary and will be supported in your action by Her Majesty's government. Do not, however, attempt to take any action which you are not certain of being able to accomplish successfully." I'm sorry to all the British people. So Cave attempted more negotiations with Khalid, but these failed, and Rawson sent an ultimatum requiring him to haul down his flag and leave the palace by 9 o'clock on the 27th of August, or he would open fire. During the afternoon, all merchant vessels were cleared from the harbor, and the British women and children were removed to St. George, and a British India Steam Navigation Company vessel for their safety. At 8 o'clock in the morning of the 27th of August, after a messenger sent by Khalid requested more negotiations with Cave, he replied that he would only do so if Khalid agreed to the terms of the ultimatum. At 8:30, a further messenger from Khalid declared that we have no intention of hauling down our flag, and we do not believe that you would open fire on us. Cave replied that we do not want to open fire, but unless you do as you are told, we shall certainly do so. At 8:55, having received no further word from the palace aboard St. George, Rawson hoisted the signal, "Prepare for action." At exactly 9 o'clock, General Lloyd Matthews ordered the British ships to commence the bombardment. At 9:02, Her Majesty's ships Raccoon, Thrush, and Sparrow opened fire at the palace simultaneously. Thrush's first shot immediately dismounted a 12-pounder cannon. 3,000 defenders, servants, and slaves were present in the largely wooden palace, and even with barricades of crates, bales, and rubber, there were many casualties from the high explosive shells. Sultan Khalid bravely led his forces. Just kidding. He ran for his life and left the slaves to go die instead in the palace. The shelling stopped at around 9:40, by which time the palace had caught fire and the Sultan's artillery had been silenced. Now remember that epic Zanzibari navy I told you about earlier? Well, fear not, because it finally did something. At 9:05, the obsolete Glasgow fired upon the St. George, using her armament of 7 9-pounder guns and a Gatling gun. That would show them who's boss. The problem is that the British just fired back and sunk the ship, and its crew hoisted a British flag as a token of their surrender. On land, Khalid's men had been much more effective. Never mind, they were basically just as useless, and the fighting ceased with the end of the shelling. The British now controlled the town and the palace, and by the afternoon, Hamoud bin Mohammed had been installed as Sultan with much reduced powers. Around 500 Zanzibari men and women were killed or wounded during the bombardment, most of the dead a result of the fire that engulfed the palace. However, the British casualties were much worse, with one petty officer getting wounded aboard the Thrush, and later just recovered. Now, although the majority of the Zanzibari townspeople sided with the British, the town's Indian quarter suffered from opportunistic looting, because, apparently in a war, that's the most important thing to do, and around 20 inhabitants died in the chaos. To restore order, 150 British Sikh troops were transferred from Mombasa to patrol the streets. Sailors from St. George and Philomel were landed to form a fire brigade to contain the fire, which had spread from the palace to nearby customs sheds. There was some concern about the fire at the customs sheds, as they contained a sizable store of explosives, but luckily no explosion occurred. Sultan Khalid, the inspirational leader who fled at first shot, sought refuge in the Prussian consulate, where he was guarded by 10 sailors and marines, while Matthew stationed men outside to arrest them if they tried to leave. Despite extradition requests, the Prussian consul, the recently posted Albrecht von Reckenberg, refused to surrender Khalid to the British, as his country's extradition treaty with the United Kingdom specifically excluded political prisoners. Instead, he promised to remove Khalid to Prussian East Africa. At 10 o'clock on the 2nd of October, SMS Seadler of the Imperial Prussian Navy arrived in port, and Khalid was taken to Dar es Salaam in Prussian East Africa. Khalid was an absolute genius, escaping the consequences of his actions. Oh wait, what's that? Prussian East Africa will be taken over by the British in World War I, and Khalid will get captured in 1916? And yes, that is exactly what happened. Khalid was given the Napoleon treatment, and he was exiled to St. Helena, but was eventually allowed to return to East Africa, where he died at Mombasa in 1927. So whatever happened to Sultan Hamoud? Well, he was a good boy, being loyal to the British and acting as a figurehead for an essentially British-run government. Several months after the war, Hamoud abolished slavery in all its forms. But of course, that was too good to be true, and within 10 years, only 17,293 slaves had been freed, from an estimated population of 60,000 in 1891. What happened to the main British leaders meanwhile? General Raikes, leader of the Askaris, was appointed a first-class, second-grade member of the Order of the Brilliant Star of Zanzibar on the 24th of September 1896, a first-class member of the Zanzibari Order of Hamondier on the 25th of August 1897, and later promoted to commander of the Zanzibar armies. General Matthews, the Zanzibari army commander, was appointed a member of the Grand Order of Hamondier on the 25th of August 1897, and became first minister and treasurer to the Zanzibari government. Basil Cave, the consul, was appointed a companion of the Order of the Bath on the 1st of January 1897, but, maybe they should have given him some shampoo while doing that. And he was promoted to the Consul General on the 9th of July 1903. Harry Rawson was appointed Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath for his work in Zanzibar, and would later be Governor of New South Wales in Australia. Rawson was also appointed a first-class member of the Order of the Brilliant Star of Zanzibar on the 8th of February 1897, and the Order of Hamondier on the 18th of June 1898. Honestly, they did deserve all these fancy-schmancy titles, since there would be no further rebellions against the British for the rest of their control over Zanzibar. And everyone, but especially the British, lived happily ever after. The end. And that, folks, is the story of the shortest war in history. It lasted less than 45 minutes, though the exact length was either 38, 40, or 45, with 38 being the most commonly cited one. The variation is due to confusion over what actually constitutes the start and the end of a war. Some sources take the start of the war as the order to open fire at 9 o'clock, and some with the start of actual firing at 9:02. The end of the war is usually put at 9:37, when the last shots were fired and the palace flag was struck, but some sources place it at 9:45. Anyways, hope you all enjoyed, and if there's a lesson to take home, it's that you shouldn't try to stand up to the largest empire in history, especially if you are some tiny island in Africa.